All right. Hello and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Alan Watke, Deputy Director of Events with Politics and Prose. Thank you all for joining us tonight, welcoming Peter Robison, celebrating his new book, Flying Blind. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll throw in the chat to purchase a copy of Flying Blind on the Politics and Prose website. You'll be able to ask Peter a question by clicking on the Q&A link, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. We'll get to the audience questions towards the end of the reading and try to get to all of your questions, but apologize if we run out of time. Also, closed captions are available for tonight's event if you click on the CC link, which is right next to the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We are so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping PMP afloat. And now, I'd like to welcome to PMP Live, Peter Robison, celebrating the release of his new book, Flying Blind, the 737 MAX tragedy and the fall of Boeing, a suspenseful behind-the-scenes look at the dysfunction and mismanagement that contributed to one of the worst tragedies in modern aviation, the 2018 and 19 crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX. Peter Robison is an investigative journalist for Bloomberg and Bloomberg Businessweek. He is a recipient of the Gerald Loeb Award, the Malcolm Forbes Award, and 4 Best in the Business awards for the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. He's a native of St. Paul, Minnesota, with an honors degree in the University of Stanford, and he lives in Seattle, Washington, with his wife and 2 sons. Joining Peter in conversation tonight is Moe Tkacik, a senior fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project. A former journalist, Tkacik has worked for the Wall Street Journal, Time, the Philadelphia Daily News, Philadelphia Magazine, among others. She has written about business and economics for the New Republic, The Baffler, Bloomberg Businessweek, and Reuters. And so now, please welcome to PMP Live, Peter Robison and Moe Tkacik. Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Politics and Prose is one of the great bookstores, and thank you to everyone for coming. I just wanted to start by talking a bit about why I wanted to write this book. The 2 crashes in 5 months of the MAX planes were shocking because Boeing has long had such a high reputation for engineering excellence. And I had been a beat reporter for Bloomberg covering Boeing from 1998 to 2002. And it was a very consequential period in Boeing's history when it had just purchased McDonnell Douglas, which was a rival aircraft builder, which was really falling out of the business at the time Boeing bought it, and had a reputation for focusing heavily on shareholder returns. And what happened at that time was really a reverse takeover by McDonnell Douglas. You had many of their leaders take on powerful roles at Boeing. At the same time, Boeing was facing an escalating challenge from Airbus, which had developed a newer narrow-body plane called the A320 that rivaled the 737. So it was a real crossroads moment, and that culminated in the period when I was covering the company in a strike by engineers that lasted 40 days. And the unusual thing, it seemed to me as a young reporter at the time, was that the engineers were not striking primarily over wages and benefits. They were striking over what they saw as the strategy of the company. They framed their strike as a referendum on management. They said if we don't change the way they're managing this company, it's not going to exist in the way it has in the future, because the company was very had decided that focusing on shareholder value, which was such a preeminent theme in American business at the time. Jack Welch was someone who was lionized in the industry, and he was feared and envied by the leaders at Boeing, by Phil Condit and Harry Stonecipher at the time. And it was soon after that strike that Boeing moved its headquarters to Chicago, and it said explicitly at the time that this is we're doing this in order to create a leaner corporate center focused on shareholder value. That's a long way to say that what that meant in practice was that a company that had been balanced between focusing on shareholders, employees, and customers was focused from that point predominantly on shareholders. And at one point from 2013 to 2018, 80% of the free cash was going back to shareholders in the form of dividends and buybacks. So it felt to me that I felt duty bound to write this book to try to dig into what had happened, and in part because I think what happened at Boeing is emblematic of what's happened across American business. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to your questions, Mo, because Mo looked at these very issues in a brilliant New Republic article in 2019. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. That was a great introduction. Thank you for writing this book. I found when I was writing that piece, I hadn't written about aviation before. And there was just so much love for Boeing among the people who were criticizing it, its former workers and its engineers. Really timely, given that we're now headed into Strikesgiving after Striketober. And I think it's unique, looking back on that 2000 strike, the SPIA strike of 2000, that's the white collar engineers union that covers, that represents most Boeing engineers. They went on the longest strike in white collar union history in 2000. A strange time to be, involved in any sort of labor activism. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was just looking back in 2000. You were covering Boeing, but you're in Seattle, and Amazon's there, and Microsoft's there, and Starbucks is there. Well, none of those companies, makes anything with, not, what do they make? Well, none of those companies makes anything with a million parts. Did it occur to you when you got that beat, and maybe we should talk about that, you were covering the coolest company in Seattle, or were you at the time kind of taken in by this? Because one of the things that I think is so telling about your book is that it's not a book about brash personalities. It's not Adam Newman or Elizabeth Holmes. It's not about these. It's not about con artists, although certainly a lot of these, Jack Welch was a con artist. But it's inherently a company that, involves, thousands of incredibly intelligent people in a cooperative effort. And that's just something that you don't see. So I would love to hear, about covering that strike and how you felt, because clearly these were really intelligent guys. Stan Sorsher led the negotiation committee, right?
Right.
He's a PhD physicist, completely brilliant. Not kind of your typical. Oh my God. Sorry.
Hi.
Sorry, it's bedtime. But yeah, I'm eager to hear how, like what I think, how your thoughts have evolved, because right now we've just, we've just seen the John Deere workers have a successful strike. That's another company that's, raked in the cash, showered it back down on shareholders, and they just ended an incredibly successful strike, which was most uniquely successful because they had the whole community behind them. In an era when Joe Biden's approval rating is 38%, the John Deere striking John Deere workers' approval rating after they, rejected the contract a third time was something like 62%, with 17% of people in Iowa supporting the company. So you have this incredible realization, I think, right now in America that the people who are making the stuff, the people who are working in the factories and making this stuff run have been ignored, and they've been exploited, and they've been discounted and marginalized, treated like I forget what the unit, what the great turn of phrase was from Sorcerer, but they have been marginalized and dismissed at the altar of shareholder fundamentalism for so long. And but back in 2000, we didn't see things that way. So I'm curious to hear that.
At the time, that was the heyday of what we now think of as late capitalism. But at that time, the Business Roundtable, the lobbyists for big U.S. companies, had determined that that the first duty of any company is to shareholders, and we've seen that reversed recently. Companies have. Brian Moynihan at Bank of America has talked about customers and employees more so recently, and I think what you had at the time was the preeminence of Jack Welch and this focus on just these mottos like "fix it, close it, or sell it," and rank and yank, and just the financial engineering. You had at the time GE promoting this idea that companies should be about services, not manufacturing. They created a large bank inside their company, and we've seen the problems with that recently, and GE is now breaking apart. And at the time, but Boeing was very influenced by that, and I think the response by Phil Condit and management at the time was to look at the threat that was coming from Airbus and say, we can build a larger company, we can expand into satellite markets, we can rely on our military side. As an analyst at the time said, the danger is that you put up all these tent poles and then you look around and you've got no tent. And what we're seeing now with Boeing is that its product lines have not been invested in to the extent that they could have been. $40 billion was spent on buybacks from 2013 to 2018 that could have financed many new aircraft. And the point that Boeing's later CEO Jim McNerney made in 2013 when he announced the plan to focus more heavily on buybacks was that it could do this because it had the best products. And as we learned in the Max debacle, Boeing had not invested as heavily in the product as it could have. There were engineers who were urging Boeing to put in more sophisticated flight controls, and that was those managers resisted that, so ultimately Boeing wanted to spend $2.5 billion on a simple derivative, and in the end, after the crashes, putting these planes in storage, having them grounded, compensation to airlines, the cost is $21 billion and counting. So that's why I hope you get a chance to read the book, because I go into a lot more detail about all these subjects.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, I came upon what I now think to be a pretty apt analogy, which is Boeing's pursuit of shareholder value is sort of like, it seems when you're watching from afar like, a a diabetic, trying to save money by rationing insulin. And just watching how that, okay, so first you're going to amputate a toe, and then you'll amputate the foot, and then you'll amputate the leg, and then your eyes, your vision will go. And that's literally through the 787 Dreamliner, which was a total nightmare and over 3 years late. Oh God, kid number 2. And then to the Max, it's just been, it's been unbelievable. You would think that they would learn their lesson, that this pursuit of unbelievably short-term shareholder value it's a terrible deal for shareholders in the long term. Unfortunately, the stock price isn't nearly as low as it should be. So I'm kind of curious, and there still seems to be a general just like reality distortion field enveloping this company and its leadership, and then the kind of, I don't even know, I've yet to speak to anyone on Wall Street defending them anymore, but certainly it seems like they have a lot of, they have enough defenders to have kind of escaped any real consequences at the very top. So one thing that is that's useful to know is that there was a financial incentive. Gabe, please go away. Oh my God. Sorry. So there was one big financial incentive when it came to not investing in R&D, and that was this whole, well, if we just release another 737, then the airlines won't have to train. We can, we won't have to train any pilots. But it'll sail right through certification. We won't have to go through all these hoops. So let's just keep releasing the same old thing, and we'll and milk this baby as long as she'll last. And that's kind of what happened with the 737 Max, right? One thing that so getting back to the heart of the issue, 737 Max was equipped with this secret software that caused it to literally self-hijack and dive into the ground, or in the Java Sea in the case of the Indonesian. And it didn't tell anyone about it, but this software, you suspect that this software wasn't even necessary, that they sort of packaged it as a safety mechanism, but what it really was like a kind of ploy to conceal the differences in handling the 737 Max, which had these massive engines, from the earlier versions of the 737. Is that basically right? Do you want to kind of explain?
Sure. So the software, in certain parts of the flight envelope, all aircraft need to handle the same through the stall. They have to have the same. Let me start. So Boeing, in order to certify the 737 Max as the same as the 737, it had to show the same characteristics in all parts of the flight envelope. There was testing done of the stalls at high speed, and it was determined that the stick is supposed to give consistent forces all through the stall, because the engines on the Max had been moved more toward the front of the wing and higher up, and they were bigger. That caused the plane to tilt up more. So in other situations, Boeing might have changed the hardware to deal with that. There's something called a vortex generator that can be added to the wing, or you could change the size of the tail. In this case, software was chosen because one reason is that software is cheaper. So the software called MCAS, for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, was put in the plane. There's nothing objectionable about that. It fired based on two different sensors, one tied to G-forces, one tied to the angle of attack sensor. However, late in flight testing, there was testing done of low-speed stalls, which is when you're closer to the ground. It's often at takeoff or landing. And in those low-speed stall situations, it was found that this same tendency to pitch up, this same handling characteristic was happening. So MCAS was designed to apply to the low-speed area as well. The problem with that was that the AOA sensor, it was that the G-force no longer applied, so it was tied to just one sensor. And the failure effects were not fully tested, which has come out in the congressional investigations. And when the pilot on that plane in Indonesia discovered that this was happening, he hadn't been told because the AOA, because in order to certify the plane on the same certificate, it had to have the same it had to have the same manual. You didn't want to introduce a difference to the plane that would have required additional testing, because that would have led to additional cost for Boeing. So the pilots were left completely surprised by MCAS when it finally emerged in that plane in Indonesia.
Yeah, and you do a really good job, I think, kind of just laying out how the many times that they could have made the system more robust. They could have avoided, obviously, the complete ignorance about that this thing existed, that, by just explaining it. They didn't want to do that because they didn't want to jeopardize that. I guess initially they made the promise to Southwest Airlines that they, there would no chance in hell were they going to, was this new model going to require simulator training? And you go through why that was pretty expensive, not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. And then at some point they decide, not only is it not going to require simulator training, it's only going to require level B training, which is like 2 levels less training to the point where it was like a 56-minute iPad course. And so there's all these, in order to, because it seems like they were under a lot of pressure to make sure that nothing went over level B. They really, really shot themselves in the foot. At one point, Ludke, there's a what was Rick Ludke's title?
He's a flight deck engineer.
So he's a flight deck engineer.
Flight controls, yeah.
And he's been one of the most helpful whistleblowers in this whole thing. He's never talked to me, but I'm a big fan of his. And because he really, really did a great job. He's really done a great job explaining how all of this works. And that's one of the most incredible things about this story is that there's so many, it's a very easy fuck up. You don't have to be, you don't have to be any sort of STEM genius. I'm a college dropout, so you don't even have to have a college degree. You don't have, to understand how bad this was and how stupid this software was. But it's hard. It's when you're a journalist to accuse a company like Boeing that has like 165 lobbyists. And God knows how many, lawyers and public relations, crisis communications experts on hand. It's difficult to have the confidence to get your editors to go along with calling out a fuck up as big as this. But that happened pretty early because there were so many whistleblowers who came out of the woodwork and said, this is this is unacceptable, and this is how it happened, and this is, this is what it was. So Ludke at one point said, this system, this deadly system that turned down the nose of the plane like 2.5 degrees, and it did so, fired repeatedly every 10 seconds in response to a reading from a single angle of attack sensor. Now there's 2 angle of attack sensors on every 737. There's 3 on the Airbus equivalent. 3 would have really been helpful. But because there's only 2 on the 737, they figured, well, what if they disagree because one has failed, or one has been pushed off in a bird strike. Shoot, if they disagree, then we'll have to get the pilot to do something about it and determine which one is wrong. And if we do that, we're gonna have to put something in the cockpit. We're gonna have to put a cockpit alert. And if we do cockpit alert, then we're gonna have to tell people that MCAS exists. And if we tell people MCAS exists, maybe the FAA is gonna say, hey, level B might not be enough. Maybe we need level C. So there were so many moments like that where the absolute wrong thing, the system became so much more deadly and so much more vulnerable as a direct result of the initial lie that they told. It's like a lie that spirals out of control. It's like some, children's book I'll probably be reading in a couple minutes. So that was, I think that you did a really great job kind of going through that. But what was really, really difficult to wrap my head around again when I was reading the book was once they realized they had made this mistake after a plane crashes perpendicular to the ocean in Indonesia, what they did after that, which was, they let's see, they got together, they got their lawyers together and got, a release form together and started, got Lion Air to fly in all the family free of charge, and put them up and bring them to this crisis center where they had explain, tell us about the Lion Air Crisis Center, because I think it's just very telling that was the first move, the first thing that Boeing did before
Right.
they issued their directive to the FAA.
Right. So the plane has crashed in Indonesia, and at that point, Dennis Muhlenberg was emailed. This has come out in shareholder lawsuits since. He was emailing with his staff members and saying that he has his government team on it and working all angles. Looks like he can rely on support from the FAA. He's talking about the fact that pilot union, that pilots at the time, the pilot grapevine was jumping because they hadn't been told about this software. Other pilots, I got into this in the excerpt that appeared in Bloomberg Businessweek this week. Other pilots were saying that this was unconscionable, that this system had been added without telling the pilots. But Dennis Muhlenberg in emails was telling people that the pilots just wanted to make more, they just wanted to be paid more because if the Max were a different type, that would trigger more pay. Meanwhile, at the Crisis Center in Jakarta, the standard damage control process kicked into place, and that it was that agents on the ground for Boeing's insurers were presenting these blanket releases to families in Jakarta, offering $90,000 if they signed away their rights to sue. I talked to a couple of lawyers named Sanjeev Singh and Michael Indrahana, and Michael Indrahana was there. He's Indonesian American himself. He was there and he caught wind of what was happening in the crisis center, and there were, he said it was like a CIA interrogation room where families on this WhatsApp thread said it was like a CIA interrogation room. There was a table in the center, a camera tripod, and the idea was, and some people didn't speak English very well. Some people were just told what the form said. But I talked to one woman named Rini Sugiono, whose sister died in the crash, sister and brother-in-law, and the day that she brought the two daughters of her sister to talk to a psychologist, and she was presented the form. She happens to be a petroleum engineer who speaks English very well, and it struck her as strange that there was several hundred companies listed on this form that were to be released from liability. So she walked away and didn't sign it, and later connected with Michael Indrahana and Sanjeev Singh. And the way they describe it is that this is it's an essentially racist and deceptive practice that that really was only taking place because this crash happened in Indonesia. And I'd been told by other family members that the second crash in Ethiopia would not have happened if the first crash had not taken place in Indonesia, because as one person, Paul Naroji, said, that he felt his family died. He lost 5 family members. He felt his family died because the first crash didn't happen in the US or the UK, where lives matter more than in other places, as he put it. So all that was very hard to report and to learn. And it's the part of an airplane crash that's tragic is that the victims, as one person put it, there are 2 muggings. There's the first mugging when you lose your loved one, and then there's the second mugging when you learn that they didn't have to die. And then perhaps there's a third one, which is that they continue to have reminders of their loss going forward. So yeah, and anyway, that's in the chapter of the book dealing with the Indonesia crash.
And meanwhile, back at home, Boeing sort of quietly informed the FAA that they might want to put out a directive reminding everybody of the runaway stabilizer checklist. And at the very last minute, the FAA, they had initially written something to explain MCAS, and at the very last minute, that part was stricken from the directive. And it really wasn't until journalists started looking at this that that it became a big deal in the aviation world. But it wasn't it wasn't anything that was interrupting. I mean, obviously Boeing's stock price peaked in February, right after the crash in October. They were working on a fix. They held a meeting with American Airlines Pilots Union, and told them that it would be 6 weeks, and it wasn't 6 weeks. The FAA gave them 10 months, right? Was that Ali? There's a FAA figure, Ali Barami, who figures prominently in this saga, and also that of the 787 Dreamliner, which which never killed anybody, as far as I know, but could have, and was also grounded after a series of battery fires that were unexplained. But it looks like at the end of the day, the FAA hadn't actually tested for that possibility. So they're dealing with it. The DOJ launches an investigation into the certification process, and they're kind of they're not even really, I mean, was anybody in that period really even trying to hold Boeing accountable. I believe that the wife of the pilot, was it Suneja?
Sangeeta Suneja was the mother of the pilot of the Lion Air plane, and she was saying, let's look at the performance of the plane, and she was questioning. She works for an airline herself, and had questioned the fact that her son had not had simulator training on the Max, and the issue between the two crashes. The issue was that alarm bells were going off. As I get into in the book, you have pilots. There's a dramatic closed door meeting at American Airlines where the pilots had decided ahead of time that if as the head of the union said, if what they heard was a PR message, if it sounded insincere, that they would record the meeting. And it was only a few minutes before the meeting started when they started recording it. This is in November after the first crash, which was in October. And what Boeing was telling them was, this is just a little piece of software. It's fully accounted for in the design and certification. The pilot and the software work together in tandem. And at that point, the pilots jumped up and said, "Wait a minute, we don't work together. We don't know anything about this software."
Right.
It was, and at that point, Mike Sinnott was the Boeing VP who was there, and he mustered the same intensity finally and said, our commitment to safety is as great as yours, and we're going to work expeditiously on this software update. Not a year, but a couple, maybe 6 weeks-ish was his comment. And then several months later, the ghost appeared at the controls again of the Ethiopia plane. And the issue there was that those pilots tried to rely on the updated checklist, which, as you mentioned, had been developed after the first crash, and the checklist was not enough. The same software fired repeatedly. The pilots tried to they called it at the same time left alpha vein. They tried to respond, but were not able to.
They couldn't move the trim wheel because they were going too fast, and that hadn't been addressed. That problem that was actually laid out. There's this YouTube, pilot influencer, who's extremely. He tried it in a simulator. He did a really scary video showing his attempts to run through the runaway stabilizer checklist that Boeing had advised in case of uncommanded nose down trim, which is what they encountered, and it was impossible, and he was using all of his strength, and it was very telling, and that's essentially what happened. But yeah, that was it's worth pointing out, just because again we're in strikes giving. One thing that I felt going through this story was that the presence of labor unions throughout this whole supply chain, pilots and flight attendants to maintenance workers to obviously the engineers and the machinists, made a little bit more transparency possible than if this had happened at another company. Right. It was, and it kind of they made safety culture possible. And that's a thing that, you hear a lot about when you go through, when you talk to anybody in aviation about anything, is, they're constantly citing this phenomenon of safety culture, which, requires many redundancies, would never, allow a single point of failure, which this is the safety culture that everybody historically been inculcated in this, whole industry. And this was just such a blasphemous violation of safety culture. And so you realize, like, wow, this is a culture that wouldn't have been able to exist if not for unions. Now, Boeing has been one of the many Jack Welch proteges, I guess the second of three that we've got leading this company. Every new one seems worse than the last. McNerney, he really hated unions as much as Jack Welch, and after a strike in 2009, right, he moved basically now with the entire 787 production to South Carolina, and they tried and failed to organize that shop, but there are still there are a lot of labor unions, and the American Airlines Pilots Union was extremely helpful at illuminating this for the press. I mean, they did a really courageous job, and because of that, the president of that union ended up kind of getting kicked out. He ended up getting voted out. I think that I think that Boeing, Boeing must have somehow bankrolled his opponent. But sorry, but that was just another little.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about the safety culture is interesting, because Boeing's airline customers have had a safety committee on their board. What emerged after the Max tragedies was that Boeing itself did not have a safety committee on its board, and Dave Calhoun the current CEO of Boeing was claiming later that the Boeing had met soon after the crash and had decided to keep the plane flying. It did not. It had an optional meeting before Thanksgiving, and what the judge in the shareholder suit brought against Boeing determined was that each of Calhoun's representations about the active board after the first crash was false. You don't see that very often, that a federal judge says a CEO's each of his representations was false, but that was the case. But Boeing does seem to be talking more about safety. Dave Calhoun mentioned the word safety 159 times in his statement to shareholders. So time will tell if the safety culture is improved at Boeing.
We have some questions now from the audience that just reminds
Great.
me, and the first one is one that is near and dear to my heart. Hundreds of people died, 347 if you include the diver, right? Is anybody going to jail? And this is something that is a great chapter of your book. If somebody goes to jail, and his trial has now been moved to February, there is one guy that they pinpointed right away as the fall guy. His name is Mark Forkner. And Peter, why don't you give us a little intro into who this gentleman is, and whether you think that he deserves to carry the weight of this horrible tragedy.
Sure. So Mark Forkner, when his name emerged in the press, was often referred to as Boeing's chief pilot, or someone very high ranking. He did have the title Chief 737 Technical Pilot, which in Boeing's ranks is pretty low to medium ranking. He did not have much influence into the design of the Max. He was carrying out the orders of management, which was level B training. As you described, anything above that would have been more expensive for Boeing. So his mandate was to get the FAA to approve that level training. He, from everyone I've talked to, he's a hardworking guy. He cared a lot about his job. He wore a Seahawks jersey at work. So it was shocking to them that the guy who wore the Seahawks jersey emerged with a lawyer named David Gerger, who had previously represented the chief financial officer of Enron and a BP engineer who was accused of manslaughter in the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Because shortly before the October hearings, when Dennis Muhlenberg was to testify in Congress, what I was told is that staffers at the House Transportation Committee were given the latest release of documents from Boeing, and one of them got a call from someone at Boeing to say you should look at the one on the top, and the one on the top was were what became infamous messages from Mark Forkner talking to a fellow pilot in a simulator about a hairy ride that experienced in the simulator, which seemed to duplicate the conditions that led to MCAS. He complained that he hadn't been told by other test pilots that MCAS applied to this low speed situation. It was trimming itself like crazy. And so this was the smoking gun, as Peter DeFazio said, that Boeing knew ahead of time that the Max software was problematic. The problem with that is that what Forkner said is that he lied unknowingly. He hadn't been told. And so Ted Cruz confronted Muhlenberg over these messages during the hearings. Muhlenberg begged ignorance, said, Forkner had since left the company. He said, we're not quite sure what Mr. Forkner meant. We think he's referring to a simulator. His lawyer has suggested he was referring to a simulator that was in development. What I was told is that Gerger is in fact paid by Boeing through its director and officer and insurance liability policy. So the evidence may suggest that Forkner is a convenient scapegoat, that he's a low-ranking pilot who said impolitic things. He's also the person who said that he used Jedi mind tricks to convince regulators to approve the level of training he wanted. So it is somewhat shocking to people I've talked to that this person would be the one person at Boeing to be criminally charged after everything that's happened.
Yeah, it's really a complete, I mean, if you look at the emails, I always like somebody who, doesn't speak in too much jargon and tells it like it is. I found it very difficult even to understand what people were so mad about in Mark Forkner. There's one point where he's accused of maligning, of making fun of regulators, likening them to dogs watching TV. But if you look at the actual he's saying he's the dog watching TV. I mean, he's saying it's all of us, we're not people who are engineers don't understand this, some of these technicalities. He's just I just don't understand how anyone expects a jury to convict this guy unless his representation is just absolutely negligent. But it does make me think they never offered him immunity, did they? There's much about this story, there's much about this narrative where in a normal business book you get, again, these big brash personalities. This feels so much of it feels like a story about the deep state in action. And that would make sense because Boeing is, the number 2 defense contractor, right? I mean, they have, again, 165 lobbyists or something like that. They have an enormous amount of influence in Washington, and you do a good job illustrating guys like Ludwig and their until recently general counsel and Jerry Ludwig and Ken Duberstein, a longtime Boeing board member that was a real insider in the Reagan administration. So kind of, you know, folks like that, they're extremely entrenched. Another story, but speaking of people with connections on the Hill, another question that we have is talk about the role of Ralph Nader and his extended family in pursuing truth and justice here. And that's a thing that, you know, I think Ralph Nader had a grandniece who died in the Ethiopia Airlines crash. And one of the things that I found so poignant, Ralph is like 87 now. He's as lucid as ever. And, you know, I voted for him in 2000 and I'd do it again in 2024. That's just me. But he regretted it. He blamed himself because he knew he had been watching the Lion Air crash and he did not trust the Max, and he wished that he had told her about his reservations about the plane. So why don't you go into how important and critical they have been to?
Yeah, he's famously wrote Unsafe at Any Speed that made GM extremely angry, and his family is, you know, well versed in the ways of Washington, and his niece Nadia Millerone and her husband Michael Stumo early on organized a campaign. They went to Congress people's offices. They visited 50 offices and really just tried to make people see, you know, that Boeing needed to be held to account. It's obviously incredibly tragic circumstances because she was someone who was going to extremely accomplished and was going to Kenya to work on broadening access to healthcare for women. And there were so many accomplished people on that plane in Ethiopia, UN members, people going to a UN delegation. And the other tragic thing is that Michael Stumo knew Stan Sorsher, who was the engineer who 20 years previously had worried that Boeing was making these changes that could lead to tragedy. And so what Stan told Michael in one of their conversations was that they really needed to look at the way that the FAA had delegated work to Boeing, that the previous system, which had FAA managers overseeing people at Boeing more directly, had resisted undue influence by managers to speed the development of the planes. And he said the new one invites it. So when Michael Stumo and others and Paul Naroji and others testified in Congress, you saw extremely informed people who got to speed very quickly and mobilized an effort that you saw ultimately lead to testimony by Muhlenberg, and he was ousted in December.
Yeah, it's one thing about that is that, you know, I keep wrestling with this idea that the Lion Air crash, you know, that we don't value foreign lives the way that we value American lives. Because, and as one of our other attendees has pointed out, you know, this said that, I'll tell you this. We can all agree that Boeing has burned the furniture to keep the stockholders warm after top management was infected with the GE Jack Welch Rift virus. The ultimate issue in all this reminds me of the evil story of murder and greed from Purdue and OxyContin. In both cases, where the hell was regulation? FDA never should have allowed opiates. FAA never should have allowed the amateur incompetence of MCAS controlled by a single point of failure. SEC shouldn't have allowed stock buybacks. Please talk about the failure of FAA accountability. And like, I think that we talked about this, there's a lot of parallels to the way that they reacted, not least to the victim blaming that was the core of this public relations strategy on both parts. Purdue blaming their legal travails and all of the death that they caused on evil addicts, and Boeing blaming the pilots they had killed for being not well trained enough, when it was clear that they had done everything in their power to not let them get training. But it's one of those cases where if you and yet Boeing and Purdue Pharma. I mean, Purdue Pharma was it turned out to be a very very well connected company, but it was a family business with like one other real that they sold an antiseptic and a laxative before they hit on the OxyContin blockbuster, and yet they exerted enormous control over the FDA. So it's one of those things where it's a case where all most of the people that Purdue has killed have been Americans, and we didn't do anything about it for close to 20 years. Sorry, there's a little fake toilet flush going on in the background. But yeah, I mean, this is a case where the Purdue case was one that I was very familiar with when I was starting to look into Boeing. What was shocking to me was that this would happen to Boeing and the FAA. And I think that the story that you tell is just, the FAA has always sort of been, Boeing has always, sort of controlled the FAA or had an enormous amount of influence. Oh my God. But it was a far different company 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Well, right. You had the neutering of the FAA happened over time, and it really starts with the Reagan Revolution and the idea that government is the problem, not the solution. You had budget cutting starting then. I've heard the argument that the FAA has never recovered from the cuts to the inspectors that were made at that time in the 80s. The lack of funding, continued through the Clinton administration, which had this, sort of triangulating zeal to reinvent government. So what you saw was the FAA forced to kind of pursue these business mandates and to meet business goals. And the engineers I've talked to say that they found that managers were promoted, based on this metric of meeting stakeholder needs, which ultimately meant satisfying the customer, the customer, for a time, the word customer meant the manufacturer and the airline, for the FAA, which is, supposed to be an agency that regulates aircraft for the safety of all of us. But before that time, the manufacturers and the airlines were called applicants, and many, longtime engineers were horrified that they would have to refer to these people as to these companies as customers. I've talked to engineers who talk about how it used to be that their managers were very versed in an engineer named Mike Collins talks about this. He talks about how when he joined the agency 20 years ago, his managers were extremely versed in technical details, and they worked together with the specialists below them to make sure that the manufacturers were following the regulations. As it's changed, since an organization was under the system called organization designation authorization, the whole oversight is transferred to Boeing, and you have this system where the specialists felt that their managers were working together with managers at Boeing to try to get the planes produced. I talked to one person, one former Boeing employee, who talks about how it got to the point that an IOU would be introduced in development, that if a technical issue was lingering, there would be an agreement to say, well, we have this common interest in getting the plane out. Let's move forward. And he said that relationship is toxic.
Yeah, you do a very good job also at conveying how impossible it was to work at the FAA. There is another question that we have here is who actually received any of that $2.5 billion settlement? This is something.
Yeah, the $2.5 billion is the headline number that the Justice Department came out. I talked to one person who worked at the Justice Department who said that he was shocked that the Justice Department would put that headline figure and claim credit for that headline figure, because the headline figure is money that Boeing probably would have spent anyway, because 1.77 billion of that is settlements with airline customers who were victims here because the plane was grounded, but Boeing was negotiating with them anyway. Another 500 million was settlements to families, which Boeing was also negotiating, and which number was going all up and up and up from those first $90,000 settlements offered to Indonesia. So the actual amount of the criminal penalty was only $243.5 million, which, as the settlement explained, was equivalent to what might have cost Boeing to have pilots train in a simulator in the first place, because it had promised Southwest $1 million per airplane if the final version of the Max required simulator training.
I don't know when this started, but throughout this, the conduct of the DOJ has been very suspect. That using that number, it kind of, raised my alarm bells. And then they put out an astonishing statement when they signed a deferred prosecution agreement with Boeing in January or February of this year. Mommy! And the deferred prosecution agreement is like bullshit anyway. They're never, they never like amount to anything. AIG was under one, for instance, like during when it, blew up the world. AIG was a little bit more like Mark Forkner in that case. Citigroup blew up the world. But anyway, but they didn't even appoint like a monitor. They didn't, this was like one of the most lenient deferred prosecution agreements ever. And they put out this amazing statement saying that they, they thought about, appointing a monitor, but Boeing, it wasn't systemic. The lying and the half truth telling really was, it was exclusive to a very narrow realm of the company or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Justice Department deferred prosecution included this exculpatory statement of senior management that the behavior was did not extend to senior management, which is unusual according to people I've talked to, and as the judge in the shareholder lawsuit,
the judge says, like David Calhoun doesn't know how not to lie. Like he is like he's pathological. Like he lied. He lies even when the lies make him look bad. When Boeing looked bad. That's one of the funniest things. I remember he stuck out to me because he gave a quote to right after the second crash. He gave a quote to the Washington Post, which had done a story. Oh, where was the board on this whole thing? And Calhoun says, we were meeting on this. We made the decision to not ground the plane, and no, I wouldn't do it differently. That was the right decision at the time. It looked like an anomaly, and basically really doubling down, saying that it was the right decision at the time. It was the right decision. This is saying that, we killed an additional 159 people, and that was the right decision. Truly bizarre. But as it turns out, they did no such thing. They had no such meeting. There was no such decision made. They weren't, they got like a very boilerplate briefing during Thanksgiving week on the crash, and nobody asked any questions, and nobody ever thought about it again because the stock was going to 500. So he told a lie that made him look like such a pig, because I remember immediately after that, I said to myself, this guy's the next CEO of Boeing. I'm sad to say I was right.
Another comment of his was that, fairly early on, that deadly assumption, came to light within the company. And I've talked to pilots at American who say, when were you going to tell us about that deadly assumption? It's hard to imagine.
Hello. Welcome
Hello.
back.
Yeah. Well, I know you guys could keep going for a while. I could tell, like, this is a very important conversation. Huge topic, and thank you both for this. And thank you for, forging through with the unpredictability of children.
I'm so sorry.
No, we both know what that's like. So
But
it was a fantastic conversation, and thank you both so much. And I want to thank everybody that joined us on PMP Live. It's your participation in these. It's the book sales for these that keep us going as well. So there's a link in the chat. If you can click on that, that'll take you straight to the PMP website to purchase Flying Blind. That supports Peter as well. So I want to thank everyone for being here.
You should have a
and Mo.
special Christmas bundle of for this and Empire of Pain, because if
Right.
you read both of them back to back, you will become a communist. No. I'm just saying. I'm not trying to make anyone into communist. But it's like I would love to teach a class with these two in particular, because you see all around you a growing recognition, like I said, with the deer strike, that the way that our capitalism works in America right now is completely broken, and this is such a searing indictment of that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming. And I know it's past bedtime, so good night. That was amazing how you forged through. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all. Yeah, there he is.
Yeah, we could go. We could go another hour.
Right.
Well, thank you
so
all
much.
again.
Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.